practices of the Jewish temple. When you would go into the temple, you would prostrate yourself, or proskuneo, towards the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was. And on top of the Ark of the Covenant was the quote-unquote mercy seat, and that was the very presence of God. So you were prostrating yourself towards that superior. It was a practice in the temple, but not the synagogue. So there was a difference there, that because you were in the synagogue, you didn't have that mercy seat. You didn't have God present to prostrate to. Should be ready. All right, let's see. Looking better? There we go. So that was the week 1 summary. Steve, I think you'll appreciate my icon there. It's week 1 in a nutshell. Always have to start out with some sort of joke. So this slide is everything I just told you. The week 1 summary, the 5 words, the one we looked at next week. We're going to look at the next 4 words to see what they mean in context. But those will go a little bit faster. The farther we go, the faster it'll get, because proskuneo was the most common by like twice as much as all the other words. The next one will go in depth. The last 2 have 1 slide each, so they will go faster because they're just not used nearly as much. If I do go too fast, or you don't understand something, you have questions, I'm not a guy that's like, hold your questions to the end. Just holler. Let me know. If I just need to pause so you can think, we can do that. If you want discussion, holler out. Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling. Okay, so we went over proskuneo. The next word that is the next most common is latreo, or latreia, depending on is it used as a verb or used as a noun. It appears about 26 times in the or it appears 26 times. How it's translated, even more so than proskuneo, greatly dependent on which Bible you pick up. So if you pick up the ESV, which is the one I use most common, what I've quoted for most here, and how I did the counts at the very top, it's translated worship 14 times and 12 times as service or to serve. To serve being the verb form. The more you go down there, you see NIV only translates it worship 10 times, CSB 9, King James 4, and then the New King James is the least of the 5 I looked at, only translates it worship in 3 cases. The reason they struggle on this one is because it implies more than just service. So if they just take the translation service, the literal translation as service, and they translate it, it misses that context. So they often try to translate it worship, but in our language, worship includes so much that I think it overdoes it and goes the other way. Outside of Scripture, you also see this one, and then it goes beyond service, that it means sacrificial service. And unlike proskuneo, which was also used in cultural context, this one typically is a religious word. So if you want a kind of the clear context, that third bullet, latreo is to serve deity with sacrifice. And most common, that sacrifice was literal, I'm taking an animal, putting it on an altar, or taking, they did more than animals, plants, money, whatever it was, I am sacrificing that. But it also referred to other, just like, personal sacrifices. So not just animal sacrifice, but that was the most common. Just like as we look through these, when you see passages that referenced a posture, such as they knelt down and worshiped, you could guess that it was proskuneo. When you see references to worship related to the temple, or you'll see sacrificial language, you'll be able to look really smart and guess that the underlying word is this. Those are kind of the indicators that tell you, the context was this sacrificial worship rather than the prostration worship. As we go through these, again, I really want to look for application. How does this context apply to us? So one thing that I'm looking for is, in context, is it talking about anything that we would do today, or that would apply to us today. And going back to the earlier anomaly, none of these are used, and something to really watch for yourself. I don't see any of these use cases that refer to the Christian assembly. So in this case, there's 11 of the passages that speak specifically of like the temple in the Old Covenant. I'm only got 5 of those in here because they're all kind of redundant, so I wasn't going to go through each one. But here's Luke. You have prophetess Anna. It says she did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And on a lot of these, I put the translations in the various that the various translators have chosen, because like I said, this one varies so greatly depending on which Bible you pick up, that only in two cases this is worship. Hebrews 8:5 says they serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, and it goes on. So again, that word serve is this latreo. And in all 5 translations, same word, and you see again the temple terminology. Later in Hebrews, now even the first covenant, related to the Old Testament, had regulations for worship and earthly places of holiness. Again, ESV, NIV, worship, serve. In the King James and in the CSB, it translates this regulations for ministry. So Romans 9:4 is an interesting one. So it's still describing activities that happened in the temple or the Old Testament. They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, again that's latreo, and the promises. And I say this one's interesting because the other translations, NIV says the temple worship, the King James says service of God, and in CSB, temple service. The word temple, the Greek word temple, is not in the passage. Those are being added here because the translators are saying there's more to this idea of service. It's that sacrificial temple service. So they're inserting temple, saying the service of God. Again, they went with the service translation, but the word for God in the Greek is not there either. They're trying to add those things to add that extra context that you miss if you just translate as service or worship. Hebrews 9:6. This one translates it slightly different, or this is 9:6, it's a different verse, but a different translation of latreo, performing their ritual duties. When you look at the others, it says carry on their ministry, performing their ministry, accomplishing the service of God. There's, again, that of God that we saw in the previous, and then performing the services. So again, none of these are translated worship. They're taking the same word. They're trying to provide that different context. Okay, so those 11 of latreo were all in reference to the temple, and specifically the temple in those activities, not the synagogue or other Jewish activities, but specifically the temple. So wouldn't apply to us today. These two, specifically to idols, worship other than God. Acts 7:42, God turned them away and gave them over to worship. And I highlighted down there, did you bring me these slain beasts and sacrifices? Again, looking for those contextual clues, this is talking about sacrificial service. Romans 1:25, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served. And in this case, served is latreo. So even though the word worship there, that's actually another one we haven't gotten to yet, which is the Sabo group, which is something the translators run into. These words appear together. And so if they translate them both worship, it would be gave them over to worship and worship the creature. So they had to pick which one they were going to translate worship. And when you do that, obviously, then you lose context. And so those were related to idols. Here was Jesus and Satan in the wilderness. And we covered these a little bit with proskuneo because, again, you have two different words that can be translated worship in the same passage, and so they had to choose which one. So latreo here got translated as serve, but this is the exchange between Satan and Jesus, where Satan's saying, bow down to me. Jesus quotes the Old Testament, says, no, I don't proskuneo or latreo anybody but our God. Here it's translated service, and again it's sacrificial service, but specifically referring to sacrifice of Christians, literally killing Christians. They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. And we saw that with Saul running around killing Christians. He thought he was serving God sacrificially. So, or they took it as their sacrificial service that they were offering to God. Paul references it. It doesn't really tell us exactly the act or what he's saying, but Paul references it as the God whom he latreos, the God whom he worships or serves. So when he sails to Rome, he makes note of, he stood before an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I worship, or whom I serve, depending on the translation you pick up. ESV is the only one there that translates that worship. Romans 1:9, for God is my witness whom I serve, again that's the word, with my spirit in the gospel of Son. And I thank God whom I serve, in 2 Timothy, as did my ancestors with clear conscience. So again, not talking about an act within the Christian assembly, but a sacrificial service of Paul himself. So then we have four passages that are, I call them kind of the metaphor latreos, where they have to clarify. So Romans 12:1, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present bodies as a living sacrifice, again, that sacrificial context, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual latreo. And I call it the metaphor, because in the context, as we've discussed, typically this would be sacrificial services, and typically literal, like there would be an animal or something that you'd be sacrificing. So Paul has to qualify, he's like, no, instead of that, now we have, this is your spiritual worship. So providing more context that he's not talking about that, because typically it would. Philippians 3:3, for we were the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus, and put no confidence in the flesh. So again, he's saying we worship in the Spirit now, not the physical sacrifices. And then two passages in Hebrews in chapter 9. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve, that's the word, the living God. And I didn't put it here, all translations translate that serve. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshipers, so referring to a person, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin. But in these sacrifices, and I included this verse to call out, you see, again, the context there is sacrificial. You look at these again, yes? No, so the red worshipers is the latreo, sacrifices, and this is where you see other words that indicate, what they're talking about. So I highlighted sacrifices. That's a whole nother word that's never translated worship. It's always translated sacrifice or something similar. But tying those together, you always see, when you see latreo, it's always in this context of sacrifice. And so these are all kind of metaphorical, how we do sacrificial service or sacrificial worship spiritually rather than what they would have seen as literal expectations. Correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what Paul is trying to get across, is that if you left it at Latreo, that would be the context they're thinking of, is what do I literally need to start sacrificing? So he's clarifying spiritual sacrificial worship. Philippians 3, you see worship, the sacrificial worship by the Spirit. Hebrews 12:28, therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. This one provides the least context that I could find. It's just, acceptable Latreo. And then it appears twice in Revelations discussing the temple or worship in heaven. 7:15, therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. And then later in chapter 22, no longer will there be any accursed, but the throne of God, of the Lamb, will be in it, and his servants will worship him. So again, these are going back to temple terminology, but the Revelations temple that John sees in his visions. So we've gone through all of them. So back to my original kind of question, and was which ones of those apply to the corporate worship today? Hopefully it's becoming very clear that the answers, they don't. They're referencing proskuneo, prostration in greeting towards the superior, and latreo, serving deity with sacrifice.
That we are to present our bodies a living sacrifice, so if you want to.
Yes. So I would apply, we're told to provide our bodies as a living sacrifice. It doesn't necessarily tell us to worship, or to provide our, in that passage is not one that's associated to the ecclesia. So all of this may apply spiritually to us. The question is, when we come together in the church, what does it mean for us today to worship together when the worship terminology to them, yeah. These two are very, very frequent together, not just in our scripture, but in pretty much all religions. At the culture of the time, these two were the definition of what they would think of religion. So every religion, they had a temple, they had altars, they would go sacrifice to those altars, and typically you would go into the temple, and there would be an image of, I put several examples, Baal, Asherah. You would have the Greek gods later, where they had to have Zeus, a temple to Zeus. And so you would go into the temple, there would be an image, and because that was a deity and a superior to you, you would prostrate before that, and then you would offer your sacrifice. Often we make the mistake of assuming that every religion is basically the same, you just insert a different name. I think about the Hindus that have all these gods, and it's very easy to get in the idea of, well, that's their god, so they have this church service, and they go in and they sing songs, and then they maybe they don't have what we would consider Lord's Supper, but maybe then they have teaching and preaching, and most of us would be very shocked if we went over to their temples and see them doing something completely different than what we do, because it's a different religion. These two were kind of that definition. You just closer to different Greek gods. And so you would go into the temple and you would do these two things. And even in the Jewish religion, they had these two things. They had a temple. You would go in and you would prostrate and you would offer your sacrifices. That would only happen in the temple, not the synagogues. And every male was required to go up to the temple only 3 times a year. I get into the same mistake of thinking, oh, well, it's the Jewish temple, so you would go every Sunday and you'd go in and they would preach and they would teach. And no, they were doing those two things in the temple. But this was, if in our terminology, if we said, who do you worship? And they said, Dagon in the Old Testament, what that means is that was their God. They would go to the temple, they would prostrate, and they would offer sacrifices to him. That was religion. You see this in the Old Testament, in Exodus 24 and 5. And originally written in the Hebrew, but we do have a translation that's been found, the Septuagint was found where it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, so a very old translation. And whoever did that translation at the time decided that those Hebrew words, when translated to the Greek, would be proskuneo and latreo. So it says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image of any likeness or anything. You shall not bow down, proskuneo, to them or serve them. That's the sacrificial service. ESV says serve, but the NIV put worship in there. Because, I hadn't always understood this from the, don't make carved images. Don't make for yourself a likeness of God. I always kind of separated that from the rest of the passage. But it's basically saying, hey, this is the idea of religion. You don't do that with any other god. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. But the Jews did too. In the Jewish temple, they did the exact same thing. They didn't have a carved image of our God, but everything else looked very, very similar. We touched on these already when Jesus was in the wilderness. Again, you see these two together. So the idea of who's your God, Satan said, make me your God. Do these two things to me. And Jesus says, no, I don't do those two things. And he quotes the Old Testament saying, no, I do those only to the Father. In Acts, we see them again together. 2 verses immediately following themselves. If you look at verse 42, God turned away and gave them over to worship of the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, did you bring me slain beasts and sacrifices? So this one, again, you have that reference to slain beast sacrifices describing latreo worship. Then it goes into verse 43. You took up the tent of Moloch, the star of your god Raphan, the images that you made to worship. So again, worship with proskuneo is bowing down towards a superior, and that was the images that it's saying not to make. So you have the context that show which type of action they're talking about. When we look at the earliest Christians, they rejected that this was the idea of religion. So you have Justin Martyr, who was martyred. That's where we get the name. In his defense, quoted, "What sober-minded man then will not acknowledge that we are not atheists, worshiping as we do the maker of this universe, who has no need for streams of blood and libations and incense." Because they didn't proskuneo, because Christians, we didn't have a temple at that time. They had the Jewish temple. Well, by 160, that was destroyed. So they didn't have a temple. They weren't going in into the mercy seat or to an idol and bowing down. They weren't offering sacrifices, because he says, we don't have any need of these anymore. Because they weren't doing those two things, they were accused to be atheists. He said, no, we have a God. you just misunderstand how you're supposed to, what we would call worship him. So neither of these were used in the context of Christians in the assembly. The question is why? Before Christ, these were primarily temple activities. They're no longer necessary after his sacrifice. We don't have the Holy of Holies. We don't have the mercy seat where we would consider, like, that's the presence of God on earth, and he's not, he's active other places, but that's where you actually encounter him, so that's where you would prostrate yourself. And we no longer have that need for those sacrifices because he has covered that for us. Their understanding of that got them killed. Going to move on to the next word. So those are the two, but any questions or thoughts on those before I move on? I don't want to move too quick on. All right. So we'll go to the next word, which appears less. There's only 15 occurrences of letter geo. Letter geo. Hopefully that's coming across right. My throat's a little scratchy. 15 occurrences in the New Testament. 115 in that Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. In the ESV and the CSB, it's only translated worship twice out of that 165 times. In the NIV, it's only translated worship once, and in the King James versions, not translated worship at all. Which, I don't know why. I don't know why if 165 you can translate it as something else, you choose that once or that twice to make it worship. The context here is almost always priests or some sort of priestly duty or service. So you'll see latreo as serve. This one's also translated serve or ministry. But it's while latreo is widespread, as in I would come and I would provide my sacrificial service, the letter geo is in reference to the priestly service. And when you think about the temples and the sacrificial service they were doing with the animals, we kind of minimize that to, okay, you go in, you kill the animal, you're done. There was so much blood, so many carcasses, the preparation, just maintaining that one temple in Jerusalem took a lot of work. And that was part of their priestly duties, was not just to go in and make the sacrifice, but to keep it moving, because there were a lot of sacrifices to make, there was a lot of blood, there was a lot of cleanup, there was the tools, and there was a lot of ceremonies around those that the priest had to do, and all of that was wrapped up into this concept of a priest performing their duties. Because there's so many occurrences, there's 15 in the New Testament, I'm just going to go over 2 or 3 of them that are the worship words. Except for this one. I'm starting with one that was not translated worship, but Philippians 2:25 through 30, we see this here twice. Both of the red are letter geo. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. One of the things that I really want to show with letter geo is that it's often service to someone. So it can describe those temple activities, but Paul frequently, and even in the temple activities, when I'm performing a sacrifice as a priest, I'm usually doing it on behalf of somebody. They're bringing their sacrifice, I'm doing it to cover their sins. Letter geo has that same kind of context. It's a service for somebody, but it's just elevated to this priestly service for someone. And in this case, it's a minister specifically to Paul's needs. And it's called out twice in this passage in that manner, that ministering to Paul's needs, and then their lack in their service to Paul. Let's see, I had some other notes. In verse 25, it says, minister here. In the NIV, it actually says, take care of my needs. So it's talking about taking care of Paul. Okay, here's one of the passages where the ESV translates it as worship. It says, in the same way he sprinkled the blood, both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. In the NIV, it translates it in its ceremonies. In the other translations, it says in the vessels of the ministry. So again, when it's translated service or ceremonies or duties 100 times, I don't know why ESV chose worship here, but this is what it's referring to, is that priestly duty or priestly worship in the context of the Old Testament temple. And then Acts 13. Now there were in the church, so that's the ecclesia at Antioch, prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were worshiping, and this is the Letergeos, the Lord in fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work which I have called them. The King James versions put ministering to the Lord, and the others put worship here. I noted at the outset the one passage where you might see these words in the context of the ecclesia, and this is it. And that's only if you don't look at the King James translations. So maybe this is the closest we're going to get. Two thoughts I have on this is, one is it doesn't actually say they're worshiping in the assembly. If I talked about like, oh yeah, I go to church with him, saying they were in that assembly. Even if we put it in the context, what does it describe? If we keep the same context that Letergeos usually has when it's translated non-worship and all the others, they were serving in a priestly fashion. Not necessarily as priest, because we don't really ever see that distinction, at least in the New Testament. It comes later. But seems to be the context here, is it's elevating these individuals as performing a ministry, performing a priestly duty of some sort, and they were part of the church or doing that in the church in Antioch. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Through all that word study, is there one specific word that stands out that says we ought to come together and sing 3 songs of prayer, 2 songs of Lord's Supper kind of activity?
We don't have one word that describes the actions of the assembly. We do see that these, other than this one passage, that the words that they use for worship, which in some cases, like this one, the first 2 we looked at were very specific activities. This one is broader, where it's like priestly duties. But again, this is the only time that it's ever used in the context of the ecclesia, and very, very loosely at that. So you never see this one word that encompasses the activities that they performed when they came together. We will be looking at those activities that they did when they came together, but those are never described using the worship language. Did I answer your question?
Well, I get a feeling as we go along, this question is going to get asking ourselves as we do this study is, when we come in here on Sunday morning as a group, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing, or should this gathering be shaped in a different way, moved in a different direction? We have a tendency now to come in here and sit down and wait for Shane to get up and entertain us. Well, I mean, he's an actor, and we don't think of God as the audience and we as the performers. But in reality, that's what it is. God is the audience, and we are the one performing the worship to Him. Or is that what we're not going to get out of this word study? We're going to find something different. I think that's the piece of
That is the
we're going to
question.
chew on all the way through.
Yes, exactly. And that's where I think this can confuse us, because if we take what we call worship and we read it into the passage where they're bowing down before an idol in a temple, it doesn't fit. Which is not going to lead me to say that we're doing anything wrong. So I'll set that up right now. But we can confuse these passages if we don't understand the context in which they were written. And if we misunderstand it, we could do something wrong. I don't think we are. I know we'll get there. I don't think we are, but I do think we're missing some things. What time is it? I think we do have time. I said the last two words have a slide each. And I think we could go ahead and wrap up the Greek words this week then. So the next one, it's more of a word group. You can find all sorts of variations that start with this prefix, but it's used in a couple ways, but generally used to this idea of reverence or to revere. You'll also see, I've got up there devout and God-fearing. It only appears 10 times. It's about 50-50 on whether or not they choose to translate it into worship. So 6 instances of that 10 referred to a person. So the way we call somebody a Christian or we call somebody a Jew. There's, in Acts, you see this a lot. Many Jews and devout converts. So this is an interesting thing, because when we think of somebody converting to Christianity, they're now a Christian. Jew is both a religion and ethnicity. And so you were born a Jew. And so, but you could convert. They would allow others to convert and to start sacrifices. They had limitations on where they could go in the temple and other things. But then they would refer to them with this Sabo group and would get translated as devout converts or devout Greeks to distinguish them from Jews. Sometimes, I forget which passage, it calls them God-fearing Greeks or God-fearing Jews. This idea of this fear or reverence to distinguish them from Jews who were born that way to somebody that has come through it through reverence. There's 2 instances where they're just quoting from Isaiah that they worship me. So back to this idea of reverence, they do this in vain. They fear me in vain in some passages. They worship me in vain in some. But quoting from Isaiah, again, talking about Judaism or the Old Testament. This one's not going to apply to us at all, because it was talking about the worship of Artemis, or when Paul was debating with the Greeks, he said, worship of the unknown God. So again, the idea that the whole world has this reverence for Artemis, or that the Greeks had even this reverence towards the unknown God, because they didn't want to leave any God out. So they just had a generic one that they called the unknown. And then this was thrown out as an accusation against Paul in Acts 18:13. This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to law. So again, looking through this list, not at all talking about the Christian assembly, and other than, like, if you take the convert type, you could talk about a person, but it has nothing to do with the assembly or really what they used for terminology for the Christians post-Christ. And then the final one is threskia. Only appears 5 times. Only once is referred to as worship. The other times, it's a translation of religion. So in Acts 26:5, you see this, where they have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that according to the strictest party of our religion, this is Paul speaking of Judaism, that I have lived as a Pharisee. In James, you see 3 of these instances, so it's all packed in. This just is not a common word in the New Testament. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. And then this is the one that is, in some translations, worship. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels. So the only time this is actually translated worship, it's not even reference to worship of our God, it's to worshiping angels. So going back to our question, does this one apply to us in the Christian assembly today? Not necessarily the assembly. You could say this one applies as, when somebody asks, who do you worship? Often they mean, what's your religion? That's what this word is. Let's see where we're going next. Okay. Summary of the Greek words. Proskuneo, prostration towards a superior. I probably should have included that context on this slide. Betreo, to serve deity with sacrifice, the first 2 being the very definition of religion in that culture. And then letargeo is performing the priestly duties for that. Sebo, that reverence or fear of a god. And threskia, just generally religion. On some of these, you saw the variation that some translations could put these contexts in. Some would do worship. If you did these, I'm not saying you should, but you could translate the entire New Testament without using the word worship. All right, so I know we're even a little over today. We'll come back and we'll pick up after the Greek words. If the New Testament doesn't use the worship terminology for the assembly, what did they do?